In this module, we will explore the mechanics of learning. Specifically, we will cover 3 different mechanisms by which learning can occur: classical conditioning, operant conditioning, and observational learning. In this video, I'll start by examining classical conditioning. First, let's begin by defining what we mean by learning. When you use this word in your everyday life, my guess is that you probably use it to refer to the kind of learning that happens in school, like learning a biology fact or learning how to solve a math equation. However, these are actually not the topics that we'll be covering in this module series. Psychologists do study topics like these, but learning that happens like this inside the mind is more in the purview of cognitive psychology, which we'll talk about more in Module 6. Instead, the kind of learning we'll be talking about in this module is rooted in the tradition of behaviorism. Remember from Module 1 that behaviorists rejected studying the inner workings of the mind. Instead, as the name implies, they were more interested in studying observable behavior. So by learning here, we mean a relatively stable change in behavior that is due to experience. Researchers in the behaviorism tradition also sometimes call this kind of learning conditioning. So when you hear the word conditioning throughout the rest of this module series, remember that it is basically a synonym for this kind of learning. For example, this is a picture of my parents' black lab, Poppy. When Poppy was a young puppy, she ran to go get a ball that had rolled against a baby gate. The gate wasn't secured very well, so it fell over with a loud crash, which startled her. Now, even though Poppy is much bigger and fully grown, she is still scared of the baby gate and won't go up next to it. Importantly, Poppy did not start out being afraid of the baby gate. Rather, Poppy learned or was conditioned to fear and avoid the baby gate because of this negative experience. This is in contrast to behaviors that are unlearned, such as reflexes and instincts. First, reflexes are a simple, automatic motor response that is triggered by a stimulus in the environment. For example, we already talked about how when you touch a very hot object, your arm is reflexively pulled back even before your brain needs to process this information. At one time, you may have also had your knee-jerk reflex tested. This is when a light tap on the patella automatically triggers a knee-jerk response. While reflexes are relatively simple motor responses, many animals also engage in more complex patterns of behavior that we call instincts. This might include things like predatory behavior in cats or migration behavior in many species of birds. Instincts are more complex than a simple motor response, however, they are also innate. That is, they don't have to be taught. For example, my parents' dog Poppy had to learn to avoid the baby gate, but nobody taught her to play with the ball or to love jumping in the water. She is a lab, after all. Both of those behaviors were instinctual. So how does learning, as we've defined it here, occur? There are 3 main mechanisms that psychologists study: classical conditioning, operant conditioning, and social or observational learning. We'll cover each of these throughout the rest of the module series. However, in this first video, I will focus solely on the mechanisms of classical conditioning. Classical conditioning is the pairing of 2 initially unrelated stimuli. Specifically, classical conditioning occurs when one stimulus that is initially meaningless or neutral begins to take on meaning when it is paired repeatedly with another already meaningful stimulus. You may already be aware that the phenomenon of classical conditioning was first discovered by a man named Ivan Pavlov. Ivan was actually not interested in studying learning initially. Rather, he was studying digestion processes in dogs. Ivan noticed that the dogs started to salivate as soon as they saw the experimenter who regularly fed them, and this was actually messing up his original study. However, this intrigued Ivan and motivated him to learn more about what was going on. So he set up his now famous study looking at how dogs might pair the presentation of food with a seemingly unrelated stimulus. Ivan found that if a stimulus, such as the sound of a bell, was repeatedly paired with the presentation of food, the dogs eventually started to salivate at the sound of the bell, before any food was actually ever presented. So again, this is a change in the dog's observable behavior that is due to their learning or conditioning. The dogs didn't used to salivate at the sound of the bell, but now they do. Classical conditioning always has to start with an initially meaningful stimulus, that is, something that already elicits some sort of behavioral response. In this case, the meaningful stimulus was the food. It already automatically triggered the dog's salivation. In classical conditioning terminology, the initially meaningful stimulus is called the unconditioned stimulus. Remember that conditioning essentially means learning, so unconditioned here means unlearned. That is, the dogs did not need to learn to salivate when they were fed. It was a reflex that was already automatically elicited by the presence of the food. In classical conditioning, this already meaningful stimulus is repeatedly paired with another stimulus that is initially neutral or meaningless. In classical conditioning terminology, this is called the conditioned stimulus. In this case, the conditioned stimulus was the sound of the bell. It was initially neutral. That is, this sound didn't initially mean anything to the dogs, and on its own it didn't cause the dogs to start salivating. However, the sound of the bell came to take on meaning because of its repeated association with the food. Once the bell became meaningful, it too elicited salivating behavior in the dogs. Researchers also give special names to the behavior or response that is elicited. In classical conditioning, the actual response itself doesn't change. However, the context in which the response occurs does change. When the response occurs in connection with the unconditioned stimulus, it is called the unconditioned response. In this case, when the dogs salivated at the presentation of the food, it is the unconditioned or unlearned response. Again, the dogs didn't have to be taught to salivate when they saw the food. By comparison, when the dogs salivated at the sound of the bell, this was a behavior that was learned or taught. So it is called the conditioned response. Let's go through another example together. When I was in grad school, I used to drink coffee every morning. Eventually, just smelling the coffee alone would cause me to feel awake and alert before I even drank a cup. This is the result of classical conditioning. In this example, the US is the caffeine in the coffee. As we saw in Module 3, caffeine is a stimulant that causes your body to feel more awake and alert by blocking adenosine receptor sites in your brain. So the caffeine is what initially caused me to feel more alert, and the unconditioned response is me feeling alert after I actually drank a cup of coffee. Over time, the smell of the coffee became paired with the natural effects of caffeine. So the conditioned stimulus in this case is the smell of the coffee, and the conditioned response is me feeling alert at the smell of the coffee alone. Okay, time for you to try this out on your own with an application practice question. You'll need to answer questions like this on the exam, so this should hopefully be good practice. Question: imagine that Josie has a dog, Max, who loves to go for walkies. Now, every time Max sees Josie pick up the dog leash, he gets super excited. Can you identify the US, UR, CS, and CR in this example? When looking at an example of classical conditioning, I think it is helpful to start first with the response or behavior that is being elicited. In this case, the response is the dog getting excited. Next, we have to think about what first automatically elicited this response. In this case, going for a walk outside was what first automatically elicited the excitement. The dog already enjoyed walking outside, so this was an automatic or unlearned response. So in this example, going for a walk is the unconditioned stimulus, and getting excited while going on a walk is the unconditioned response. Next, the dog learned to associate going for a walk with the leash. The leash was routinely presented right before going on a walk, so over time the dog came to learn this association. The leash was initially neutral, that is, it didn't mean anything to the dog. However, because of its repeated pairing with the walk, it came to take on meaning, and thus came to elicit the same response as going on a walk itself. So in this example, the leash is the conditioned stimulus, and the dog getting excited simply at seeing the leash is the conditioned response. Once you learn the basics of classical conditioning, you'll probably start to see it show up in a lot of areas in your life, especially if you have pets. One interesting application of classical conditioning that we see in everyday life is food aversion. Have you ever gotten sick after eating a particular food, and now the mere sight of that food makes you feel a bit unpleasant? This happened to me one time when I got very ill after eating a buffalo chicken pizza. I know it wasn't because of the pizza. I caught a horrible 24-hour bug that my dad had previously. However, even though I know that the pizza itself didn't make me sick, I have no desire to eat it again. This is also classical conditioning at work. The food is the conditioned stimulus, and it became paired with the unconditioned stimulus, which is getting sick. Getting sick naturally causes us to feel unpleasant, and now because of the association with this particular food, say a buffalo chicken pizza, the mere sight of that food is now enough to make me feel unpleasant. This is actually kind of a unique example of classical conditioning because most of the time the unconditioned and conditioned stimuli have to be paired together repeatedly over many associations. For instance, dogs don't learn to be excited by seeing a leash after only going on one walk. Rather, it takes many instances of going on a walk with a leash for the dog to become excited just by seeing the leash alone. However, with food aversion, simply getting sick once is enough to trigger the conditioned response. Classical conditioning is also sometimes used to treat phobias in people through a process called systematic desensitization. Here, the person repeatedly pairs the feared object, such as a spider, with a calming exercise. The idea is that if the feared object is repeatedly paired with an exercise that induces calm rather than fear, eventually the fear response will lessen over time. Initially, the person might start with a very low-level representation of the feared object, such as a picture of a cartoon spider, and gradually work their way up to something more intense, such as actually holding a spider in their hand. In this video, we covered the basic principles of classical conditioning. For the exam, you should be able to define learning, define reflex and instinct and explain how they are different from learning, define classical conditioning and explain how it is different from other types of conditioning, define unconditioned stimulus, unconditioned response, and conditioned response, and identify these given an example.